Episode 17, Story Leadership. Lead with a story. 1,000,000 books have been written about leadership, all kinds of leadership, different approaches and philosophies. Start with Why by Simon Sinek, Leading Change by John Kotter, Dare to Lead by Brené Brown, Good to Great by Jim Collins, Leader Shift by John C. Maxwell, Servant Leadership by Robert K. Greenleaf, and finally, a new edition that has been extremely popular is Multipliers, How the Best Leaders Make Everyone Smarter by Liz Weissman. I love this book. And how do all of these authors explain their philosophies and approaches? They tell stories about leaders who exemplify those philosophies and approaches. How else can you explain what a multiplier is without telling a story about a leader who makes everyone around them smarter and more productive? So as you listen to this podcast, start thinking about the leaders that you've worked with, good and bad, because the stories that you tell about those leaders are the best way for you to inspire and educate the people that you work with or speak to. That's how you get to lead by example. Story example. Welcome to the Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life 20-minute podcast. I'm your host and story coach, Doug Stevenson. From my global headquarters in a bedroom turned into an office here in Tucson, Arizona, I help people who want to harness the power of story to be more effective leaders, speakers, and salespeople. People come to me for story and speech coaching. I'm a story strategist, a story coach. Now, in this podcast series, I'm going to share with you practical storytelling hacks, techniques, and holistic approaches that will make your stories stick. Stories that sell you and your product or service. Now, if you feel that you learned something valuable today, please click on the follow or subscribe button. In this podcast episode, I'm going to tell you some stories about leaders that I've either worked with or seen in action. Now, once again, keep thinking about the leaders that you've worked with, good and bad. Write them down. You can craft those stories into masterpieces later. All right, let's get started. Good and effective leadership is easy to spot. You know it when you see it and experience it. It's the same with bad or lousy leadership, toxic leadership, what I like to call jerk leadership. You also know the difference between good and bad leadership because you've probably worked with both. I know I have. The good leader is someone who supports you and gives you room to grow. You want to work for them and give them your best effort. Liz Weissman calls them multipliers. You look forward to going to work every day because they inspire you. And on the other side, the complete opposite is the bad leader, someone who diminishes you, who makes your life miserable by micromanaging and criticizing you. They get in the way of you doing your job, and they even take credit for things that you did. Ugh, I've had that happen. The bottom line, in my opinion, is they're miserable people who like to make everybody miserable as well. I've worked with both types of leader. And as a professional speaker, I've had the opportunity to speak at conferences where I've interacted with CEOs and presidents, VPs and sales managers. I've seen them in action, how they interact with their teams and people around them, including me. And that's where I've been able to find my best leadership stories. I remember a huge conference that I was speaking at in Denver, at the Denver Convention Center, thousands of people for one of the largest bank chains in the United States. I was doing 5 breakout sessions on storytelling for leaders. And after every session, someone would come up to me and brag about their president, what a good storyteller he was. So that night, they had a big awards banquet for over 1,000 people, and the president was going to be speaking. So I was really looking forward to seeing this guy who everyone raved about. He'd obviously earned their respect and admiration. Well, when he walked out on stage, this huge raised platform with an enormous video screen behind him, he only took a few minutes to greet everyone before he started telling a story. Now, it wasn't a long story, nothing gigantic or dramatic, but it was about a time that he ran in a 10K road race. But he surprised me with his animation. When he talked about running in the race, He acted like he was running, doing a little jog and moving his arms, like somebody running. He used the story to talk about perseverance and determination. And while it wasn't dramatic or funny or even really well crafted, I could see why people loved this guy. He wasn't a typical boring leader standing behind a lectern reading a speech someone else wrote for him. He was real, genuine. He chose to be himself rather than some structured and calculated version of what so many executives think they're supposed to be. And I left thinking, this guy is not some amazing speaker or storyteller, but for the people in his company, what he did up there was enough to make them love and respect him. So lesson number one, just tell a story. It doesn't have to be amazing, but it does have to be real and from personal experience. Now, I had the exact opposite experience at another event at the Palmer House in Chicago. I was hired to give a keynote speech at the opening of an all-day conference for an insurance company. This was different for me, though, because the president of the company wanted to meet me in person in his office when I was in Chicago doing a different presentation for the same company. So when I was done with my presentation, I took the elevator up to the 9th floor where the executive offices were and made my way to his office. Now, when I walked into his office, he was sitting behind his big desk. Get the picture. Big office, big desk. He's sitting behind the desk. He told me to take a seat. And I got to admit, I was a little bit intimidated by this guy and this whole interview thing. And so we talked for about 10 minutes and then it was over. I got the speaking gig. Well, a month later, the all-day conference was about to start. I got to the room early to do a mic check. That's the normal thing before everybody arrived. And as people slowly began to trickle in, I noticed that the president had arrived a little early as well because he wanted to get up on stage and check his notes on the lectern. And when he was done with that, he got down and started saying hello to his employees. He seemed relaxed and, walking around saying hi to people and being friendly and gracious and, having a laugh with a few people. And that was all well and good. I got to see a friendly side of the guy. Well, the conference began with one of the VPs who was acting like the MC for the day, making some opening remarks, just greeting everybody and got everybody seated and ready to go. Now, the president was going to speak first, and then I'd go up and do my keynote. So I was standing in the back of the room, and just off to my right was the president. And I could tell that he was getting nervous. Tense, maybe that's it. I don't know, but the relaxed guy, the gracious guy that was saying hello to people had gone away completely. And in its place was someone else. He had one hand in his pocket and it sounded like he was jiggling some coins or something. Yeah, he was nervous. He was obviously nervous. And then the VP MC asked him to come up on stage. And as he walked from the back of the room and took a few steps up onto the stage, the powerful president that I met in his office disappeared. He was clearly uncomfortable. His hands were gripping the sides of the lectern. You could almost see the whites in his hands. His voice was a monotone. And he proceeded to read the speech that someone else had obviously written for him. He barely even looked up to make eye contact. It was painful to watch. He was the polar opposite of the president that I saw in Denver. And guess what? He didn't tell a story. Not even close. There was absolutely nothing in the speech that was him that allowed him to have some fun, to connect, to inspire confidence in him as a leader. Lesson number 2, write your own darn speech in your own words, in your own cadence, and show up as yourself, not some corporate version of yourself. Talk about what you care about, what you believe in. Don't just do a book report about the quarterly earnings and the financial status of the company. Decide what you think is the most important thing to talk about. Create some context, your vision for the future, and then tell a story. All right, third story, another situation when I was up in Portland, Oregon, coaching an executive who was the CFO of a motor coach company. Now, I'm talking about the big executive motorhomes that cost $500,000. And the situation was that the CEO was going to step down, and there were two people in line to take his place. And this guy, the CFO, wanted to be the one to get the job. The only problem was, and in his own words, nobody sees me as CEO material, Doug. And the reason was he rose through the ranks to chief financial officer because he was good with the numbers, with spreadsheets and financial projections. But he was a lousy speaker. In his own words, he was boring. And he knew that that wouldn't cut it if he wanted people to see him differently as CEO material. So there we were, okay, there we were in a conference room at his headquarters, working on the speech that he was about to give, the critical speech where he wanted everybody to see him differently. And I asked him to go ahead and just give me some of the speech, deliver some of the speech he was planning to give. And it was god-awful boring. Oh my gosh, it was terrible. And he knew it. He said, that's why you're here, Doug. I mean, I know I'm boring and this is bad, but I don't know what else to do. So I stopped him. I said, okay, so we need to find a story. And of course he says, well, Doug, I don't have any stories, which I hear a lot, which is crap. Everyone has stories. So I asked him, what do you do outside of work, man? What do you do? Do you have a hobby or an activity? And he said, yeah, I'm a runner. Now you need to get this. I mean, you need to get this picture. He's standing there in front of me in a dull gray accountant suit. I mean, perfect accountant costume, white shirt, boring tie, looking like a guy who sits behind a computer all day. And he says he runs half marathons. Well, my jaw hit the floor. And when it bounced back up, I said, okay, well, tell me about one of your races. And as he starts talking about running races, he starts getting animated. For the first time, I saw some life in this guy's body, and I kept encouraging him to get into it, to show me him running the race, huffing and puffing. And he's looking at me like I'm from outer space. But this is clearly way beyond his comfort zone, but he's game. So he does it. Okay, he does it. And he starts to move. And as he starts to move his body and act a little bit like he's running, his voice changes. All of a sudden, he has more vocal power. He has more physical power. Well, we only spent an hour working on this. And later on, I get an email from him. And this is what he wrote. I mean, this is the email exactly. Dear Doug, the presentations are over and things went well. One man came up to me the following day and said he heard me speak before, and I was a much more dynamic speaker now. I think our coaching session gave me confidence. It was nice to get some encouragement regarding my natural style. It also validated how effective it is to tell stories and give examples to get your point across. The stories made a huge difference. Sincerely yours, John. There you go. He was an accountant, CFO who wanted to be a CEO, but unless he changed his style, unless he showed up as a more powerful, congruent, authentic person, rather than some bean counter who sits behind a computer all day, if he didn't change their perception of him, he wasn't going to get it. Now, that was a long time ago. I don't know if he got the job or not, but quite honestly, it really didn't matter to him at that moment, because at that moment, he felt powerful. He felt like he'd learned something that he could use. Now, the next leader I want to talk about is Oscar. Oscar was the founder and CEO of a transportation company, a trucking company. Now, Oscar was about 70 years old or so, with a thick crop of white hair and kind blue eyes. He had a vibrancy about him that was impressive for a man his age. Now, it was their annual meeting in Colorado Springs, where I used to live, a rare speaking gig in my hometown. And I was going to do my keynote on the positive power of change. That's a keynote I did for many years, the positive power of change. It was great. Now, this was a small group of maybe 300 people. And when I got there, the energy in the room was, well, I was happy, I guess. Kind of, it was kind of loud. People were milling around, greeting each other. And for the most part, it seemed like a pretty relaxed vibe, a good vibe. And then out of the blue, Oscar sought me out. I mean, he walks over to me to say hello and shake my hand, which was a bit of a surprise because the people I usually deal with at these things are further down the food chain. But Oscar was different. He wanted to say hello and thank me for coming. So he said to me, Doug, we're so happy we were able to get you for this conference. Now, I know you're in high demand, but Stella, my secretary, showed me your video and I was blown away. I know you're going to do a great job. Now, just so you know, they want me to go up before you and, say a few words, warm up the crowd like Ed McMahon does for Johnny Carson. But I'll try to get out of the way so that you can do your thing because you're the main show, Doug. You're the main show. So anyway, Doug, it's a pleasure to meet you. Well, after that greeting, I felt like $1,000,000. And then it was time for Oscar. So Oscar was introduced and he walked up and stood right in the middle, front and center on the stage, in front of the lectern and everything else. And he began. As I'm looking around this room, I can't help but think back to when this company got its start, hauling coal up in Wyoming. And it was just me and my brother back then, one truck. Now, Jack is gone now. But over the years, we grew and grew. Hard work and good people. Hard work and good people. That's what makes it all happen. And here we are, 300 strong with new faces every year, new shops, expansion, mergers and acquisitions. Oh, wait a minute. There you are, Stan. Is that your new Harley out there with those red saddlebags? Yes. Good for you, Stan. That's gorgeous. And I also want you all to give a hand to Stella. Stella has been with me, keeping me in line for over 28 years now. Isn't that right, Stella? Is 28 about right? Can you all give her a hand? Now, I want to get right to it because we have an amazing speaker here today that you're going to want to listen to. So here it is. Here's what this is all about. This is what I want to talk about. I know there's been a bit of grumbling from some of you about all the changes being made, all the new faces, changes in management, new policies and procedures, the things that come with a growing company. And some of you wonder why things can't be the way they used to be, simpler times. There's too much change, you say. Well, let's talk about that, okay? Let's talk about that. Some of you were here in the good old days before computers. Do any of you remember when Smith Corona came in with the first electric typewriters back in the 60s? Oh, a lot of people were upset about that change. Why do we need electric typewriters? Or how about when we replaced all the typewriters, all of them with computers? Oh my God, that made people nuts, me included. Well, the good old days weren't so good if you think about it. Who here wants to go back to a time before maternity leave? Anyone? Or profit sharing? You want to go back before profit sharing? Who wants to get rid of those changes, those innovations, huh? Change is hard, I know. Just look around. Because there is someone missing from this room. My wife, Hazel. My wife of 44 years. I lost her to the cancer 6 months ago. And that's not a change that I wanted. And for many months, I was bitter and angry and lost. Every morning when I sat at the breakfast table, drinking my coffee and eating my toast, alone. And every night when I came home to an empty house, I got to tell you, the silence, it was deafening. But I learned something in those last 6 months with Hazel. We had some wonderful conversations, remembering the good times, the good old days that, in retrospect, weren't always so good. They were hard. And as I watched her decline, as I sat and watched her breathing, I learned something about change. Change is a lot like breathing. When you stop, you die. And that's why we, my team and I, continue to make changes, to keep up with the times, to keep current, to evolve. Because if we stop, if we say, okay, this is good enough, we will soon become a company in decline. And I care too much about you and your jobs to do that. So there is something I need to ask you to do as we continue to grow and expand and innovate. Do this one thing. Keep breathing. Keep breathing. And for a few moments, the room was still. Nobody moved. And Oscar slowly walked off the stage and sat down in the front row because I was up next. Can you imagine? Can you imagine following that? Well, I did my best, but I have to admit, I was the second best speaker in that room that morning. Lesson number 3. Speak from your head with your heart wide open. Now, Oscar had a powerful message for the people in that room about keeping breathing, because when you stop breathing, you die. But as I was sitting there watching him, I realized I've never been that emotionally honest in front of an audience. I've never been able to drop down and tell the truth at that level, to reveal something challenging or painful about myself. And I learned that from him that day. I learned that you can speak from your head, you can have good content, you can have good stories, but you need to keep your heart wide open. You need to be emotionally available. You need to be emotionally honest with your audiences. You need to tell the truth, the emotional truth. So the lesson I learned from Oscar is speak from your head with your heart wide open. Now, this episode of Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life is about leadership. Lead with a story. And what I mean by that is twofold. Number one, as a leader, the way you can lead more effectively is with a story that people will remember, that sticks long after you tell it. But second, when you have an opportunity to speak, to give a high value presentation, begin with a story, lead off with a story, lead with a story. Get into a story quickly. Use the story to create the context for the content that will follow. And then after the story, you can go into your content, perhaps some boring content or technical content, but the story has created the context. It created engagement. So here's the painful truth. Every time you give a speech or presentation, you're going to be memorable. The president of the bank was memorable for the right reasons, and the president of the insurance company was memorable for the wrong reasons. And Oscar lives on in my memory as someone who made a difference in my life, not only with his story about Hazel, but with his honesty, his humility, his courage. Up until that point in my speaking career, I was doing my dance, telling my stories, being an entertainer. But Oscar showed me how to be more courageous, to share more of my heart and soul. Oscar made me a better speaker. How about you? What is your leadership story or leadership stories about good leaders and bad leaders? Find them, craft them, develop them, and then tell them. All right, well, that's it for this episode. If you feel that you learned something valuable today, there are 2 things I'd like you to do. First, click on the follow or subscribe button. And second, share this podcast with 3 people. Help me spread the word about storytelling that sticks. And another thing that you could do that would be very wise is go back and listen to some of the earlier episodes about the 9 steps of story structure, about the phrase that pays. There's some really good information in previous episodes if you're just dropping in for the first time. And I just dropped a really, really powerful episode on TED Talks. You might want to listen to that one as well. Now, if you're following me on LinkedIn, and I hope you are, please post a comment whenever I post a promo for a new episode of Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life. And as always, I'd love to hear from you with your questions and comments. Let me know that you're out there listening and learning and hopefully applying what you've learned. And if you want help with your stories, your speeches, or TED Talks, please get in touch with me. My email is doug@dougstevenson.com. doug@dougstevenson.com. Stevenson with a V, not a PH. Thanks for listening. Until the next episode, I'm Doug Stevenson.